I've been speaking to you about the atomic bombing at Hiroshima. I had mentioned to you that this has been a subject of considerable speculation and discussion, although I think in the United States, that is speculation about and discussion regarding the American justifications for the bombing of Hiroshima. And much of that discussion has really been on Hiroshima, very little on Nagasaki. I think the people who speak about Nagasaki, which is the second bomb, and in fact that was the only remaining bomb that the Americans had, which of course no one else knew, and that was on 9th August. The first bombing of Hiroshima was on 6th August, 1945. That very little of that discussion has been on Nagasaki, because of course the question remains that even if one wanted to offer some kind of justification of the Hiroshima bombing, what would be the argument really for the bombing of Nagasaki? And again, that's not something we can get into in any kind of detail whatsoever, but the principal argument has been that the Japanese, even after having seen what had happened on August 6th, and if you look at the slide over here, you have the quote from Truman: "If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth." So this is the statement that President Truman issued when he was informed minutes later, really, literally, after the bombing, of what had transpired. Right? So the expectation was that the Japanese would surrender unconditionally after August 6th, and the big holdup had to do with the fate of the emperor, whether the emperor would himself be put on trial or not. So those, that's really been the main argument. What is interesting are the kinds of things from my standpoint that I had suggested to you, namely to try to understand why they had picked Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what was the logic of it, try to understand the nature of the Cold War background to it, and just to give you an illustration of the kind of arguments that have persisted. So this is a cover in my collection of Newsweek magazine, and you can see that, right? It says Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. This issue dates to 1995, so it's 40 years after the bombing. Why we did it. And if you read it, you'll find fundamentally the argument that I had suggested to you as part of the American consensus, namely that this was required under the circumstances because it was the quickest way to end the war, and probably the way to end the war that was most expeditious with respect to ensuring a minimum loss of lives. And there again, then we have to consider the fact that, and this is not really only the logic of the American nation state, it's the logic of every nation state in the world, which is that your lives matter more than obviously the lives of anyone else. What is also interesting in the statement released by Truman is that he speaks about the fact that now we are living in the era not simply of nuclear warfare, but we're living in the era of atomic energy. And so he speaks in his statement about how atomic energy, alongside coal, oil, falling water, all of these, falling water meaning rain, of course, will be the source for generating the economy, right? So I hope that you've had some sense of how one might interpret an event such as the bombing of Hiroshima. And what I've tried to alert you to is what I have called throughout this course, sometimes explicitly, sometimes less explicitly, the politics of knowledge, that things are not what they always appear to be, that whatever the American justification might have been, I think the onus is on us to try to understand some of the other aspects of it. And such, for instance, is what I have described in my last lecture to you very briefly, the politics of masculinity, which was also a part of the logic of the atomic bomb. All right, and there is something, of course, to be said about the obscenity of this kind of victory. So Truman also said, last line on this slide here, "This is the greatest thing in history." I mean, these are his exact words, right? What does it mean when he says this is the greatest thing in history? What's so great about this? And of course, we can read the word great in many ways, that this is something unprecedented in history, But clearly there is a kind of a triumphant, victorious note here, which I think is something that really we need to, in a sense, reflect on, because I think it's bothersome to be able to be told that this is something that we should view as a sign of the victorious onward march of humanity, right? That this is just yet another episode in the narrative of progress. The Guardian, a British newspaper, characterized Auschwitz as the largest mass murder in a single location in human history, and the way I characterize Hiroshima is to describe it as the largest mass murder in a split second in human history. It's a split second, because when the bomb fell, 70,000 people were wiped out. The total number of casualties from Hiroshima is somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 to 150,000, because there were people who lingered on. In some cases, the radiation, took their lives, or the burns on their bodies, 90% burns, accounted for their lives hours later, or weeks later, or months later, and in some cases, years later. Right? And then the other interesting thing, to wrap this up, is that Auschwitz, if you're really looking at Auschwitz and Hiroshima in comparison, I think you would all agree with me that Auschwitz has virtually no defenders at all, right? No one defends even remotely what happened at Auschwitz. There are people who deny what happened, but they don't defend it. There are the Holocaust deniers, as they are called, who say that, well, the Holocaust never occurred, or if it did, it certainly didn't account for 6 million Jews. That's all a fiction. That's the worst possible reading you can get. But there's no one who's going to defend Auschwitz. But Hiroshima has a lot of defenders, right? And if you read an issue of Newsweek or any other American magazine down to the present day, I think you'll find a resolute defense of Hiroshima. And I think that the onus is on us to really put that seriously into question. All right, now, with this, I wrap it up, this particular discussion, and I want to move to the next segment, which, of course, arises out of, in a sense, World War II, the implications, the impact, the aftermath of World War II. It arises out of course, a moral awakening, in a sense, in many people that, even those who might have defended the bombing at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that there was obviously some sense of reflection that was required of some of them, such as, well, is this a one-time thing, or are we now in a new era of human history? Right? And if we are in a new era of human history, how are we going to contend with the force of atomic energy, particularly atomic energy, which is now being exploited for purposes of military domination, or defense, if you want to call it that, right? If we look at the post-World War II period, and we look also at the Tokyo war trials, war crime trials, the Nuremberg trials, it's very clear that the occasion called for, if I may put it this way, the occasion called for some kind of reflection on the human condition and how the human condition could be advanced. And I think it's in that context that we really have to see the emergence of what we might describe as the regime of human rights. Right? Now, you're all familiar with the language of human rights. If you were living 100 years ago, that language didn't really exist. Right? No one really spoke about human rights. I mean, there would be the odd philosopher here or there who might speak about the rights of the individual. Right? I mean, if you look at the classic expressions of English political philosophy, if you all the way from John Locke, defense of private property. Right? If you look at John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, he's certainly speaking about the rights of the individual, and he's speaking about representative government in countries such as Britain. Right? But no one's really speaking about human rights. So I think if we are looking at what we might describe as the evolution of a certain kind of consciousness, I think we would have to really turn to this language of human rights. And I think that it would not be an exaggeration to say that the vast majority of people have a very benign view of human rights. That is that I think that there is a kind of a consensus, for example, in this country, that there is something called human rights, there ought to be human rights, and then of course there may be some discussions, and I want to just alert you to some of the discussions, some of the contours of thinking that might help when we start to reflect on what we mean by human rights. So in the aftermath of World War II, they passed an International Convention on Human Rights, which is still the convention that largely governs how nation states think about human rights. There are, of course, many other conventions too. So when I say International Convention on Human Rights, that's why I use the word in the plural, conventions, that they're not formally all called International Conventions on Human Rights, but that's what they amount to. And there are conventions which have to do with the political rights, the social rights, the cultural rights, and all of that. And of course, we have to ask, what do we mean by human rights? Are such rights supreme or absolute? If you look at the discussions that took place in the post-World War II period, so they convened delegates from a number of countries, and then there were people from among those delegates who were called upon to draft what would become a convention. Right? And then, of course, you know how international convention and treaties work, right? That a convention has to be ratified by every country. There are countries, of course, that don't ratify a particular convention. For example, there is a convention on landmines. You know that landmines are one of the ways in which countries carry out wars against other countries. If you look at the border between India and Pakistan, large part of it is mined. If you look at the DMZ, the demilitarized zone in Korea, a large part of that is mined. All right? And there are international conventions. We know that there have been a number of civil wars in Africa where we had an acute problem of mines. And we know that there were lots of mines that were installed in places such as Indochina, right? Around Cambodia, for example. All right? So when we have an international convention on landmines, this convention has to be signed by every country before that country can be viewed as a signatory to it. And for each convention, there are always going to be a few countries that are not a signatory to that particular convention. So it holds true for all the countries that have ratified it, but not for countries that have not ratified it. Right? And that, of course, creates various kinds of problems. I mean, I had mentioned to you that the International Criminal Court, which really should be viewed, I remember mentioning it to you within the context of this whole regime of human rights, that there are a number of countries such as the United States, for example, which are not a party to the International Criminal Court. All right? So there's those sets of questions. Which countries are bound to conventions and which are not? And it may vary from convention to convention. But then there are more interesting and more difficult philosophical questions. For example, are there circumstances under which these rights can be abrogated? And we know that, of course, that very often they are abrogated or negated under circumstances of what we might describe as a national emergency. But that in turn poses a problem. What justifies a country in calling a national emergency? Right? Because you know that under the cover of an emergency, countries will exercise a license to oppress people, to oppress the political oppression. I mean, in 1975, and I lived through that in India when I was in my late teens, in 1975, 1977, they imposed an emergency in India. And when they imposed an emergency, what did it mean? It meant that constitutional rights were suspended, right? The right to habeas corpus, the right to be in possession, as it were, of your own body and to be produced in court if you are charged, and therefore to be able to make a defense. All of these rights were suspended. So there are circumstances under which countries will obviously abrogate these rights, and that doesn't mean that those circumstances are to be accepted at face value. We would have to really look at the circumstances under which that can be done. Then there's another set of questions. When do nations have the right to intervene? The United States, for example, has long advocated the view that there are countries such as Afghanistan which do not treat their women properly. And I can tell you that it may be not a matter of an explicit policy document most of the times, but there are a huge number of officials in every successive administration in the United States over the course of the last 20 years who have taken the view that American intervention in Afghanistan would be justified if for no other reason. There may be 1,000 reasons, but if for no other reason than the fact that they don't take care of their women adequately, right? They don't give them due status, due recognition. So then does that justify the United States to intervene? And then, of course, the question is who enforces these rights? And who is to actually police the enforcers of such rights? Right? So these are questions that constantly come up for discussion in scholarly circles, among human rights activists, right? But we can actually move to another layer, which might even be a denser philosophical layer. And that is the notion of human rights anthropocentric? Right? Does it assume, in some sense, as the very phrase human rights suggests, does it assume that human beings are the center of the universe, that they are the glory of creation, which is how many religious traditions have viewed it? Certainly, I would say the Christian tradition has viewed it in that sense, that the human being is, the humans are the crowning glory of God's creation. Right? And of course, human beings exercise certain kinds of faculties which animals don't. The faculty of reasoning, the faculty of distinguishing between right and wrong. Now, there's a lot of literature which, of course, suggests to us, and I know that there are partisans of dogs and cats and this and that, who will tell you that, all these animals have emotions and feelings and so forth and so on. But without moving into that, we can certainly suggest that there are certain ways in which one can obviously make a distinction between human beings and animals, and that's why I use, for example, something called the faculty of reasoning. Animals don't have the capacity to make theological distinctions between good and evil, shall we say, all right? I don't think that it would be very difficult to consent to that. Of course, the question would be whether the fact that we have the ability to make that distinction places us, in contrast to animals, places us at a higher level of God's creation. Right? So now some people have questioned it. For example, does nature have rights over humans? And you'd be surprised to learn, perhaps a few of you in this room have already read about it, but you'd be surprised to learn that in two countries, in very recent times, in last year, in two countries, New Zealand and India, there have been court cases at the highest level where, for example, the court ruled that a river which had been polluted, which was viewed as sacred, had the right to sue the state, that the river had rights. Right? And I think that, when someone reads that, they might think to themselves, well, this is a little comical. No, I don't think it's comical at all, because what it is, it's a serious questioning of this whole anthropocentric conception of rights. And if we're going to think about, I have, again, in my last lecture, I spoke to you briefly about climate change, and this is once again the occasion for bringing that back in, that if we're seriously going to think about such things as climate change and how we're going to work through this fundamental problem, I think that we're going to have to come up not simply with legal innovations of this kind. I think that this is exceedingly important, a legal innovation of this kind. And we don't know where it would lead to, because of course the question is, how does one put teeth in a court decision? If the court says that, well, the Ganga River, or the Ganges as it's called in anglicized English, if the Ganga River is viewed as sacred to hundreds of millions of Hindus, and has been completely polluted and contaminated, right? That this river therefore has the right to its own existence, the right to not be polluted, the right not to be infringed upon by human beings. Well, how exactly is this right going to be enforced? What will be the enforcement machinery? But it's a philosophically important question. And I think a question that we do have to think about. Then there's another interesting question. And this is exceedingly important because it suggests to us how the parameters of our thinking have so fundamentally shifted in the course of the last 150 years. Namely, that in the 19th century, people still spoke of duties. So there's a great Italian political figure, Mazzini, right, who becomes an inspirational figure for nationalists, because remember that Italy only became unified, right? Just as German unification takes place in the second half of the 19th century, so Italy went through that, and you had people like Mazzini and Garibaldi. And so he wrote a book called On the Duties of Man. And someone like Gandhi was very moved by such a work. But without moving into this whole historical trajectory, just think about the fact that the word duties has almost become archaic in the English language. When's the last time you ever heard of anyone speaking about duties? Right? When is the last time you ever heard the Japanese American student group or the Indian American or the Chicano, the hundreds of groups that you have on this campus all agitating for the rights of that particular ethnic group or community? When is the last time you heard any one of them speak about their duties? Right? So do rights have corresponding duties? And I think, again, it is a sign of our times that the language completely gravitated towards rights, with certain kinds of consequences. One of those consequences that I want you to think about is that even those who are in favor of limited government, and I'm thinking here in the United States, for example, of the Republicans. I don't think, by the way, they are at all, because they don't have any problem with huge mushrooming military budgets. It's just that they want limited government with respect to certain social services. They don't want any state funding for women who become pregnant and then want an abortion. They don't want any state services in a huge number of domains. But they don't have any problem with the absolute mushrooming of the military, which of course takes up the lion's share of the budget. But in principle, they claim to be for limited government, right? In principle, they claim to be for limited government. And here the question really arises that when they're advocating, or when anyone else is advocating for limited government, what's interesting is that even they, when they speak of rights, are not sufficiently reflective of the fact that when you claim rights, you're claiming them against the state. That is, it's a state that confers these rights on you, right? If you're a South Asian American or an African American and you're looking for protection from a dominant neo-fascist community in your town, right? Who are you going to look to? You're going to look to the state to offer that protection. And I think that that's one of the fundamental problems with the conception of rights, that any time we speak of rights, tacitly what we have done is that we have actually acknowledged that the state is the ultimate arbiter of these rights, right? And I think that that's one reason why Mohandas Gandhi, even though he was the most well-known advocate of anti-colonialism and anti-racism in the 20th century, also had a lot of reservations about this whole language of rights. All right? And then just to give you one last illustration before I move to the whole question of women's rights and the women's movement, because the second half of my lecture is going to be focused on that, to give you one further illustration here of what I might describe as some species of human rights, let's consider just momentarily, very briefly, the rights of children. Now, I think that in every society it has been understood that parents have rights over their children. But of course, one of the things that's happened in the 20th century is that the state has become an intervening force. Right? The state, how is the state becoming become an intervening force. So for example, if I'm inclined to slap my boy, right, which I am sometimes when I see him spending 10 hours playing video games, well, then he jokingly tells me, that I can report you to child abuse services. But of course, that jokingly is not just jokingly, because there is a subtext there. The subtext there is that the state, in fact, can actually regulate this matter. When did children move out of the sphere of their parents' custody in toto and now become part of the custody of the state too, tacitly? And then, of course, this raises extraordinary questions, but that calls for an entire course on its own, which is how have conceptions of childhood really changed? From the 1750s, when we started our course, and you remember that in the Industrial Revolution, you had children who were working in factories for 8, 10, 12, 14 hours a day. I'm talking about 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds. I hope you recall that. I know that this goes back to the remote past about 8 weeks ago, or whatever it was. But yes, that was the situation. And of course, that is unthinkable today, at least in countries which are post-industrial societies such as the United States. Right? So conceptions of childhood changed. And what is a child? Is a child a different phase in the history of evolution? Or is a child a miniature adult? Right? Is a child fully formed but simply someone who's not able to exercise her or his faculty of reasoning to the degree that is required in order to be able to function as an autonomous person in human society? Right? And when we start looking at that, then we also have to start looking at a great many other things. For example, the cultural history of toys. How have toys changed? What kinds of toys did children play with in the 18th century as opposed to our times? Right? But this is what I mean, that this is, when we're looking at human rights, we could frame it around a number of different sets of considerations, and I think that the discourse of this is far more complicated than what we would have us believe when we simply say, oh, human rights are being violated here or there. And this leads me now to the question of the rights of women and the women's movement. Because I think unquestionably, if we're looking at the post-World War II period, in particular the post-World War II period, if I had to think of something in the geopolitical scale, right, that had consequences for every society, one would be the question of decolonization, but that was fundamentally a question for countries of Asia, Africa, to some extent Latin America. And of course, as I've tried to point out to you, we can even think about, for example, something like the American Civil Rights Movement as America's own decolonization inside this country, right? But geopolitically, that was one fundamental consideration of the post-World War II period. I think the second fundamental question would undoubtedly have to be the rise of women's movements. Now, in order to locate that, I have to spend just a few minutes in the 19th century and put forward in rapid order a number of very complicated arguments in order that one can understand how one must think about the question of women's rights, which is that, and the first proposition is that until relatively recent times, and even today, I would say that there's a great many people who actually will hold to the view that was held in the 19th century and long before that, and that view was that women and men occupy very different spheres of life, right? And they occupy very different spheres of life partially because of the fact that women have reproductive capacities which men don't, that they are the bearers of the nation's children, so forth and so on, all right? And these different spheres of life meant that women were largely going to be confined to the home, to the domestic sphere. Although, again, I think that there are lots of societies where women's labor outside the home simply was not recognized. I mean, if you look at farming, in most countries in the world, women were always part of the enterprise of farming, all right? They may not be pulling the plow, but they were still involved in farming. So this was a conception that you had to really begin with. Now the Enlightenment in the late 18th century and then moving to liberalism in the 19th century posed a particular dilemma. And that dilemma was, and it's the same question that really arises with respect to colonized people, that is colored peoples in Asia, Africa, and elsewhere. And that was that the liberal conception was a conception of what you might call the universal man. That is that every human being is in principle endowed with the capacity to be the bearer of rights, okay? The right to liberty, to freedom, to pursuit of happiness, etc., etc. And the problem here precisely was that just as colonialism could not be reconciled with that liberal worldview, similarly, the position of women could not be reconciled. That is, to that worldview. That is, that those who were advocates of that worldview nonetheless made exceptions. So the exception that was made for colonized subjects and for women was precisely this, that they are not at this point in time ready to bear the burdens of citizenship, that they are not qualified. They may not be qualified by tradition, by nature, by training, by education, whatever the reason, but they are not. And so if you look at John Stuart Mill, he writes a book called Considerations on Representative Government. And remember, this is the same John Stuart Mill who becomes famous as the author of an essay called On Liberty, right? One of the great classics of liberalism. But Mill says very clearly in Considerations on Representative Government that representative government is only for white people. And effectively, for white men, although Mill made an exception. Mill was one of those who actually did argue against the subjection of women. But I'm saying if you look at the generality of political thought in the 19th century, it's all suggesting that there are groups of people who are not yet ready, because they are childlike fundamentally, all right? But in the 19th century, there's another interesting thing that happens. No one's really written a book on that, although I think that it deserves a book on its own easily. And what is it that happens in the 19th century? In the 19th century, they set up what I call an evaluative civilizational scale. By which I mean very simply the following, that you were to judge a civilization by how it treated its women. If you look today, for example, at UNDP, UNDP is the United Nations Development Program. You know what the UNDP does? It issues a report annually. And what does a report do? It ranks countries in terms of how developed they are. So then what does it do? In order to assess that, it has to use various indices. There are lots of variables. So for example, what percentage of the population has access to health care? All right? What percentage of the population has access to electricity, to clean drinking water, to schooling? You get the idea, right? One of those most important variables is what is the condition of women in those countries? Right? What percentage, not simply what percentage of children go to school, what percentage of girls go to school? This evaluative scale was focused principally on the female of the human species beginning in the early 19th century. And of course, there are things that are ironic about it, because the British and the French and the Americans and all the others, particularly the British and the French, they were the dominant powers in the early 19th century, right? And you didn't have too many American social thinkers at that juncture. But what is really quite extraordinary is that the very countries that are passing judgment are countries where women cannot be educated, Women did not have access to education in Britain in the 19th century. Right? So those are some of the interesting problems, but that is what I'm calling the evaluative scale. All right? And we're going to miss this next point here, but I do want to speak about, before I get to women's rights, speak about women, this idea which also arises in the 19th century. It had been prevalent in various forms before, but I think it becomes much more entrenched in the 19th century, which is the idea that women are the soul and embodiment of the nation. You know, and this in turn was, and think about the fact that we speak about a person's mother tongue, right? We don't speak about the person's father tongue. At least I've never heard the expression in all my years, and I think I've been around for a bit, right? Mother tongue. That the woman is the embodiment, the soul of the nation, which is one reason, by the way, why people all get worked up, because, you know, if you want to abuse a country, you abuse its women. And there have been feminists who have argued, for example, a very well-known book, not read so much by feminists today, but in its own time it was one of the fundamental books, a book by Susan Brown-Miller called Men, Women, and Rape. And one of the fundamental arguments she made in that book was that particularly in the context of war, why is it that mass-scale rape of women takes place? And it doesn't matter which side you're on, right? It's not just the Germans and the Japanese and the Russians who did it, and the Americans did it too. The American rape of German women in the post-World War II period. Widely documented by people who care to look at that literature. Right? No one has a monopoly on that. But why is it done? Partly because the humiliation of women, you are sending a message to the men of that community. You're so feeble and effeminate, you can't even protect your own women. That's what fundamentally it's about. Right? So what we're saying here is that this idea that the woman is the embodiment of the nation, and you know, and in every society there's this conception, not simply of the mother tongue, but that, you know, you hear stories from your grandmother, right? And they pass down from one generation to another. This becomes very much a part of 19th century thinking. And so effectively what happens is you have this kind of split between men and women, of course, the outer world. Men represent the outer world, the material world. Men go into that world. They're the breadwinners. You know, they're the ones who acquire the material goods. Women are the repository of spirituality, you know. And that's why you also find, by the way, in every Christian country, if you look at church-going rates, there are more women going to church than men. And again, there are all kinds of reasons for these phenomena. All right? And by the mid-19th century, so what you're going to have, the suffragette movement is really going to start to pick up. Most people really think about the very late 19th century, early 20th century. In the United States, women got the right to vote in 1920. In some countries, I had mentioned this in an earlier lecture, they get the vote some years earlier. But by the mid-19th century, this question of the subjection of women has now come to the fore. Okay? It's not being widely discussed, but there are platforms in which it's unquestionably being discussed. All right? And so you have, as I said, the suffragette movement, and of course the demand for universal enfranchisement. You could argue, I don't think it's an accident, that the suffragette movement really picks up steam, particularly in the second decade of the 20th century, because what you have is World War I. You have a large number of men who go to the war front, and then you have women, of course, who are going to be really on the home front, but they're the ones who are also now moving into factory jobs, ammunition industries, particularly World War II. And in all of these cases, what we find, interestingly, is that when women go into the work sphere, the war ends, the men come back, and what do? They push the women back into the domestic sphere. This has been documented in such detail. But post-World War I, post-World War II. But you have other ancillary developments which are critical. The sexual revolution. right? The role of someone like Margaret Sanger, who was a great advocate. But I have to sound a cautionary note about a number of things about Margaret Sanger and the suffragette movement, right? What is that cautionary note? These white women were ferociously racist. The suffragette movement was a movement of white women's privilege. Very few people talk about that when they talk about the suffragette movement. That's what it was. Margaret Sanger was an outright racist, outright. And she's actually a big proponent of eugenics. I mean, these are people who are also, while they're advocating for the rights of women, meaning white women, they're actually, many of them are also advocates of eugenics. They want black women sterilized. They want black men sterilized because these people should not be breeding children. That's what the eugenics movement was about, you know. So these are the complexities. Whenever you look at a narrative of this kind, there are always going to be complexities of this kind. But nonetheless, that doesn't override the fact that there was something called the sexual revolution, and the sexual revolution meant, of course, the fact that women were calling for a certain kind of sexual autonomy, the right to control their own body, and this was, of course, one of the ways in which they were making an argument against patriarchy, right? If we move into the present, we also have to then understand that there were other kinds of consequences, which is not to say that the sexual trafficking of women didn't take place before. It certainly did. But we can also say that the sexual commodification of women certainly got accelerated as everything else got accelerated under the aegis of modernity, right? And again, can't linger on this for very long. Now, I do want to look at one thing. So this is a photograph. These are photographs from 1917, 1918, 20, that period, suffragette movement, and you know, women obviously advocating publicly for rights and amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which of course eventually occurred, and that's when women got the right to vote in 1920. And these kind of cartoons were circulating. You know, it doesn't unsex her. Unsex her means she doesn't lose her femininity. The cartoonist is saying, you know, if she's mopping floors, cooking, you know, all of that, but it does unsex her if she votes. But this bottom right is another story. So this is one cartoonist's ironic reflection because he's suggesting that there is a problem with those who are opposing women's suffragette movement. All right. What I do want to show you very quickly, just take a couple of minutes and we'll end with that, is women in popular culture and advertising. And advertising I mentioned particularly because it also offers us an opportunity, once again, very, very briefly, to reflect on one of the fundamental ways in which society got transformed in the post-World War II period. You know, there's this epic network serial, I think it's called Mad Men, if I remember, and you know, like 100 episodes or whatever. But it's really all about the world of advertising. And I want to show you some of the kinds of advertisements that were absolutely routine, just standard. I mean, no, you know, self-reflexivity there at all. All right, and I'm going to close with that. They don't even require a commentary very much. So here you have, show her it's a man's world. You know, this is an advertisement for ties, Van Huysen, right? And you can see she's there at the bed, and he's sitting there like a regal person, like a king. You mean a woman can open it? These were in mass circulation magazines, in Lifetime, you know, not just women's, you know, monthly or, you know, Good Housekeeper or whatever it is, right? The supposition that, oh, well, you know, you have to make bottles with tops in such a way that women can actually open them, right? Wives, look over this carefully. Circle the items you want for Christmas. Show it to your husband. If he does not go to the store immediately, cry a little. Not a little, not a lot, just a little. Right? And then the husbands are being implored at the bottom, and then you get all these goods, right? Don't go and buy them before your wife cries, right? Cigarettes are like women. I mean, when I first came to the US, these were in the 70s, they were rampant. these advertisements. All right? And I conclude with this one, all right? Because you can see there is obviously not just sexual discrimination, there's misogyny. But this misogyny was completely internalized in the culture. Okay, we're going to end over here.